How prisoners try to survive long sentences. When time stops mattering. There's a moment, early in a long prison sentence, when time still feels real. Days are counted. Weeks are tracked. Months still mean something. But for many prisoners serving decades behind bars, that moment doesn't last. Because over time, something begins to change. Not outside, but inside the mind. The calendar stops feeling like a measure of progress. Birthdays lose their meaning. Years stop feeling different from one another. And eventually, some prisoners stop counting altogether. Not because they don't care, but because counting becomes unbearable. According to multiple interviews conducted by journalists from outlets like the BBC and the Marshall Project, long-term inmates often describe a gradual psychological shift. At first, they focus on release dates. Then they focus on surviving the year. Then the month. Then the week. And eventually, just the day. Because when a sentence stretches 20, 30, or even 50 years, thinking too far ahead can break you. So survival becomes smaller. Simpler. More immediate. Wake up. Get through the day. Sleep. Repeat. And inside that repetition, a different kind of life begins to form. One that exists entirely within prison walls.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
Entering the system, the first adjustment. For most prisoners, survival doesn't begin years into a sentence. It begins on the very first day. The intake process, documented in correctional systems across the United States and the United Kingdom, is designed to strip away individuality quickly. Clothing is replaced. Personal items are removed. Movement is restricted. And within hours, a person who once made their own decisions is now operating under constant supervision. Former inmates interviewed by The Guardian and NPR describe this stage as disorienting. Not because of physical danger, but because of how quickly control disappears. Simple choices, when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak, are no longer yours. And that loss of control creates immediate psychological pressure. Research in correctional psychology has shown that this early stage is critical. Because how a prisoner adapts in the first weeks often shapes how they cope for years. Some withdraw. Some observe quietly. Others try to establish routines as quickly as possible. But nearly all face the same realization: this is not temporary. And the system they've entered is not designed for comfort, it's designed for containment. Learning the unwritten rules. Beyond official rules, posted on walls and enforced by guards, there is another system inside prison. One that isn't written down. But is just as important. In many correctional environments, especially in high-security facilities, inmates quickly learn that survival depends on understanding social dynamics. Who sits where? Who speaks to whom? What actions are considered disrespectful? And what mistakes can lead to conflict? Academic studies and investigative reports, including those by the Prison Policy Initiative and various criminology researchers, have documented these informal structures. They are not identical in every prison. But patterns exist. Some inmates align themselves with groups based on shared background. Others remain independent. But even those who try to stay neutral must still understand the environment. Because misunderstanding it can have consequences. Former inmates have described this learning process as constant observation. Watching interactions. Listening more than speaking. Avoiding unnecessary attention. Not because they are told to, but because experience teaches them quickly. Inside prison, knowledge isn't just power. It's protection. Building a daily structure. As days turn into weeks, and weeks into months, one of the most important survival strategies begins to take shape: routine. In an environment where nearly everything is controlled externally, prisoners often create internal structures to maintain stability. Wake up at the same time. Exercise at the same hour. Eat, read, write, or study on a fixed schedule. Former prisoners interviewed by the BBC and documented in correctional studies consistently emphasize this point: routine is not just helpful. It's necessary. Because without it, time becomes unmanageable. Unstructured time in prison doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like emptiness. And over long periods, that emptiness can lead to anxiety, restlessness, and mental decline. Research into long-term incarceration has shown that individuals who maintain structured daily habits are often better able to cope with extended sentences. Not because their situation improves, but because their perception of time becomes more manageable. Instead of facing decades, they face a schedule. And that shift, from overwhelming time to controlled time, can make survival possible. The psychology of time. Time inside prison behaves differently. This isn't speculation. It's been studied. Psychological research, including studies published in journals like Psychiatry, Psychology, and Law, has documented what many prisoners already know from experience: time in confinement does not feel linear. In the short term, it stretches. Minutes feel longer. Hours feel heavier. But in the long term, it compresses. Years pass with little distinction between them. And that combination, slow days, fast years, creates a unique mental strain. Some inmates report difficulty recalling specific events over long periods. Others describe entire stretches of time as blurred. Not because memory fails completely, but because repetition removes markers. When every day looks similar, there are fewer moments to anchor memory. And without those anchors, time becomes harder to grasp. This distortion is one of the less visible challenges of long sentences. It doesn't leave physical marks. But it reshapes how a person experiences their own life. Work as a tool for survival. For many prisoners, work becomes one of the most effective ways to structure time. In correctional systems across the United States, inmates are assigned or apply for jobs within the facility. These roles vary: food preparation, cleaning, maintenance, industrial labor. The wages are often minimal, sometimes less than $1 per hour, according to data from the Prison Policy Initiative. But the purpose of these jobs goes beyond income. Work provides movement, interaction, responsibility, and perhaps most importantly, distraction. Former inmates frequently describe work as something that makes the day pass faster. Not because time actually changes, but because attention shifts. Instead of focusing on confinement, they focus on tasks. And that shift, even for a few hours a day, can reduce the psychological weight of long-term incarceration. However, access to work is not always guaranteed. And in facilities where opportunities are limited, the absence of structured activity can make time feel even heavier. Education and purpose. In some prison systems, education programs offer another path toward stability. In the United States, inmates may have access to GED programs, vocational training, or even college-level courses. A major study conducted by the RAND Corporation in 2013 found that prisoners who participate in educational programs are significantly less likely to re-offend after release. But for those serving long sentences, the impact is immediate. Education creates forward movement. A sense that time is not being entirely lost. It introduces goals, exams to prepare for, skills to develop, milestones to reach. In interviews conducted by organizations like NPR, inmates have described education as one of the few ways to build something while incarcerated. Not physically, but mentally. However, access to these programs varies widely depending on funding, policy, and facility resources. And in some cases, those opportunities are limited or unavailable. Which means not every prisoner has the same tools for survival. Transition: the longer you stay. As the years continue, survival changes. What works in the first year may not work in the 10th or the 20th. Because long-term incarceration doesn't just challenge routines. It begins to reshape identity. The longer a person remains inside, the more the outside world becomes distant. Technology changes. Families change. Society changes. And for some prisoners, those changes become harder to relate to. This process, often referred to as institutionalization, has been studied by psychologists and documented in correctional research. It describes how individuals adapt so deeply to prison life that the outside world begins to feel unfamiliar, or even overwhelming. And this raises a difficult question: what does survival really mean, if the cost is becoming someone who no longer fits outside the prison walls? That's where the story goes next. The mind adapts? Or breaks? There's a point in long-term incarceration where survival stops looking like resistance, and starts looking like adaptation. Psychologists and correctional experts refer to this process as institutionalization. It doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, over years of repetition, restriction, and routine. At first, prisoners adjust because they have to. They follow schedules. They learn rules. They adapt to limitations. But over time, those adaptations begin to feel normal. Decisions that once required thought, when to eat, where to go, how to move, are replaced by automatic behavior. Because in prison, most decisions are already made for you. Research published in criminology and psychology fields has shown that long-term prisoners may begin to lose confidence in making independent choices. Not because they are incapable, but because they are no longer required to. Former inmates interviewed by the Marshall Project and BBC have described this shift clearly. Some said that after years inside, even simple choices, like what to wear or what to eat, felt overwhelming. Others reported feeling more comfortable inside prison than outside. Not because prison is easier, but because it is predictable. And predictability, over time, becomes a form of psychological safety. But that safety comes with a cost. Because the more a person adapts to prison life, the harder it becomes to function without it. The loss of identity. One of the less visible effects of long-term incarceration is the gradual shift in identity. Before prison, a person may define themselves through roles: a parent, a worker, a student, a member of a community. But inside prison, those roles often disappear. And in their place, a new identity forms. One shaped by the environment. Studies in correctional psychology have shown that inmates serving long sentences may begin to see themselves primarily as prisoners. Not temporarily, but permanently. This shift is not always conscious. It develops over time, reinforced by daily conditions, limited external contact, and the structure of prison life. Former inmates have described feeling disconnected from who they were before incarceration. Not because they forgot, but because that version of themselves no longer felt relevant to their current reality. And as years pass, rebuilding that identity becomes more difficult. Because the longer someone lives in one system, the harder it becomes to imagine themselves in another. Mental health under strain. The psychological impact of long-term imprisonment is not just theoretical. It has been studied extensively. And the findings are consistent. Long sentences are associated with increased risks of depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges. A report by the American Psychological Association highlights that prolonged incarceration, especially under restrictive conditions, can significantly affect emotional stability. Factors include isolation, lack of control, limited social interaction, and uncertainty about the future. In some cases, prisoners develop coping mechanisms. But in others, the strain accumulates. Research has also shown that access to mental health services within prisons varies widely. Some facilities provide structured support. Others have limited resources. Which means not all inmates receive the same level of care. And over time, unaddressed psychological stress can intensify. Not always visibly, but consistently. Solitary confinement, extreme isolation. For some prisoners, the experience of long-term incarceration includes periods of extreme isolation. Solitary confinement, used for disciplinary or security reasons, places inmates alone in a cell for up to 22 to 24 hours a day. According to reports from organizations like the United Nations and Amnesty International, the psychological effects of prolonged isolation are well documented. These can include anxiety, sleep disturbances, difficulty concentrating, and in some cases, hallucinations. The United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, also known as the Nelson Mandela Rules, state that prolonged solitary confinement, defined as more than 15 consecutive days, should be prohibited. However, its use continues in multiple prison systems. Former inmates interviewed by investigative outlets have described the experience as mentally exhausting. Not because of physical hardship alone, but because of the absence of stimulation. No meaningful interaction. No variation in environment. Just repetition and silence. And over time, that silence can become one of the most difficult conditions to endure. Relationships and isolation from the outside world. Maintaining connections with the outside world is another challenge of long sentences. For many prisoners, communication is limited to letters, phone calls, or scheduled visits. But over time, those connections can weaken. Families move. Relationships change. And in some cases, contact is lost entirely. Research into incarceration and family dynamics has shown that long-term imprisonment can place significant strain on relationships. Distance, cost of travel, and time all play a role. Former inmates interviewed by NPR and the New York Times have described how communication often decreases over the years. Not always intentionally, but gradually. And as those connections fade, the prison environment becomes more central. Not just physically, but emotionally. Which reinforces the process of institutionalization. Because when the outside world becomes less present, the inside world becomes everything. Faith, reading, and internal escape. In the absence of physical freedom, many prisoners turn inward. Some through reading. Others through faith. Books are one of the most commonly cited coping tools in prison. They provide information, distraction, and, in many cases, a form of mental escape. Inmates have described reading as a way to experience places and ideas beyond prison walls. A way to maintain curiosity. To keep the mind active. Religious practice also plays a significant role for many. Correctional institutions often provide access to chaplaincy services and religious gatherings. For some inmates, faith offers structure, meaning, and community. Not as an abstract idea, but as a daily practice. Research has shown that participation in religious programs can be associated with improved emotional well-being among inmates, though experiences vary from person to person. What remains consistent is this: when external control is high, internal focus becomes essential. Transition, the possibility of release. For some prisoners, long sentences eventually come to an end. A release date arrives. A door opens. And freedom, at least in theory, is restored. But after years, or decades, inside prison, release is not always simple. Because survival inside, and survival outside, are not the same. In fact, for some long-term prisoners, the outside world can feel more uncertain than the one they are leaving behind. And that raises a difficult reality: after adapting to prison for so long, what happens when that adaptation is no longer needed? Or worse, no longer helpful? That's where the story continues. If there's one thing this story makes clear, surviving a long prison sentence isn't just about making it through the years, it's about holding on to who you are while those years pass. Because once time is gone, it never comes back. If you found this documentary insightful, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real, fact-based stories from inside the world most people never see. This is the Unspoken Stories, and there's always more beneath the surface.